Hi, this is my third video in the homeless services series. In this video, I'm addressing homeless camps. You may not like some of the comments that I make here, but want to address the entire issue as it presents itself. Some advocates of the chronically homeless believe chronic homelessness is a lifestyle choice and as such should be protected by law. Others claim it's a consequence of socioeconomic factors such as high unemployment and the lack of affordable housing, or that chronically homeless are victims of abusive childhoods, addiction, or mental illness. In any event, they oppose criminalizing what they perceive to be status beyond a homeless person's control. Still, others object to the criminalization of homelessness because it violates fundamental constitutional rights, particularly those codified in the First, Fourth, Eighth, and 14th Amendments. Historically, homelessness did not become a national issue until President Reagan's policies of deinstitutionalization were implemented. If you want to hear more about about the history of homelessness, I did a previous video on that. On the other hand, the problems associated with transients and their camps can often lead business owners and residents to demand police use traditional and perhaps somewhat punitive law enforcement methods to solve them. Many times, agencies providing services for the homeless do create a concentration of homeless camps, giving access to food, clothing, showers, and basic amenities. In Melbourne, Florida, where I was for quite a while, the Daily Bread Soup Kitchen, the Sharing Center, and the Melbourne Library are where church groups feed transients are all located near Main Street, creating constant friction between the agencies, the homeless individuals, and the local businesses. The term homeless refers to someone who's usually poor and frequently on the move from one temporary dwelling situation to another. Homeless camps take a variety of forms: tent cities, groups living under freeway overpasses, boat docks and piers, groups sleeping in parks, skid rows, those are urban areas with concentrations of poverty and dilapidated buildings, in subway tunnels, on sidewalks. One person setting up shelter in such a location does not constitute a camp. Studies show homeless camps vary in size. Some, particularly those in the woods, can be small with only a few campers. Those under freeway overpasses and in urban vacant lots and parks may be larger, with some reportedly having 100 or more people. Shelters in homeless camps range from lean-tos made of cardboard to tents to more elaborate structures. Obviously, the more established the camp is, the better constructed the housing, quote-unquote housing, is likely to be. It's important to realize that although people living in homeless camps are homeless, most homeless people don't live in camps. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, otherwise known as HUD, classifies homeless people in two broad categories: sheltered and unsheltered. A sheltered homeless person lives in an emergency shelter or transitional housing. This includes domestic violence shelters, residential programs for homeless or runaway youth, or a hotel, motel, or apartment paid for with a voucher provided by a governmental or private agency because the person is homeless. An unsheltered homeless person lives in a place not meant for human habitation, such as cars, parks, sidewalks, abandoned buildings, or on the street. About 44% of homeless people are unsheltered. Unsheltered homeless are usually single men who, unlike homeless families, are less likely to live in emergency shelter, transitional housing, or permanent supportive housing. Another categorization of homelessness is whether the status is temporary due to eviction, prolonged unemployment, job layoff, or domestic violence, or chronic. The federal definition of chronically homeless is an unaccompanied homeless individual with a disabling condition who has either been continuously homeless for a year or more, or who has had at least 4 episodes of homelessness in the past 3 years. About 18% of the total homeless population, unsheltered and sheltered in emergency shelters, is considered chronically homeless, and of those, 2/3 are unsheltered. In other words, an estimated 12% of the United States homeless population, or around 83,000 people, is unsheltered and chronically homeless. This group of homeless people may end up in homeless camps because they have exhausted all the resources available to them, or their conditions, that is, drug use, alcoholism, criminal record, hinder them from using those services, such as shelters. And I'll tell you, many times individuals who are homeless in this definition don't use the shelters because historically, shelters mostly cherry picked those individuals who would be successful within their programs. And therefore, the most highly vulnerable were less likely to be able to stay in shelters. That is changing now with the Housing First model. The idea is getting rid of all of those qualifications per se and choosing the most vulnerable first and putting them into housing. Others may have chosen the lifestyle because it frees them from competing in a consumerist society or because it's better than previous living arrangements. However, most residents of homeless camps say they would prefer to live in a more conventional way with their own room and a job. Compared with the general population, people in homeless camps are more likely to be male, older, and a minority. A significant number of transients living in camps are addicted to drugs or alcohol. And I'll tell you, many times the alcohol use or the drug use actually occurs because of the homelessness. And a sizable portion are also mentally ill. The increase in homelessness since the 80s is addressed in an earlier video. Panhandling is how some homeless camp dwellers make money, but more work at odd short-term jobs and as street vending and day labor. Collecting cans or bottles is also common. Relatively few receive any public benefits. A very small number engage in prostitution. Most panhandlers are not homeless, though. In fact, I've seen situations where vans have dropped off several panhandlers at an intersection and later in the day would come back later just to pick them up. I've also heard firsthand from these individuals that they spend one weekend at an intersection to pay an entire month's rent. Problems associated with the camps. First of all, unhealthy camp conditions. Conditions in homeless camps can be dangerous to health. Garbage attracts rodents and other vermin. Food can't be stored and dishes can't be washed properly, facilitating the spread of foodborne diseases. Depending on the camp's location, some residents may use portable toilets or public facilities, but most are likely to use outdoor location. Poor hygiene contributes to dental and skin problems. Other environmental hazards such as batteries and fuels are used in heating and cooking. Most people who live in homeless camps lack health insurance, but they frequently have chronic physical and mental health conditions that require ongoing medical attention. Barriers to seeking routine medical care lead many of them to the emergency room for non-emergency care, increasing healthcare costs for the rest of us. There is some indication that tuberculosis and sexually transmitted diseases are of special concern. Many transients living in camps report addiction to drugs or alcohol. And like I said before, many times the drug and alcohol use actually doesn't start until they end up in a homeless situation. Victimization of the chronically homeless. The chronically homeless report high rates of child and sexual abuse that occurred before they actually became homeless. Further, once homeless, the population continues to be victimized at a rate of about twice that of the general population. Chronically homeless people are also more likely than general population to be victims of crime against a person than property crime. These patterns are particularly true for chronically homeless women. Chronically homeless people are victimized by the public and by their peers. Violence against the homeless committed by non-homeless offenders appears to be increasing, even when violent crimes are generally decreasing. Many of these incidents are beatings, despite the notion that homeless camps are safe havens for those living an otherwise rough or unconventional life. These camps can also be venues for serious violent crime. In addition to concerns about hazardous materials, which potentially harm both the transients and the surrounding environment, inadequate human waste disposal at large camps along rivers and in the ocean can pose a hazard to the water supply of nearby communities. Another hazard linked to homeless camps is fires. Residents of homeless camps turn to wood stoves and campfires for heat and cooking. If left unattended, typically if they're intoxicated, these fires can become out of control and burn down a camp. structures and injure people. Larger fires can spread to more populated areas and damage buildings and infrastructure. More significantly for the environment, they may kill animals and vegetation and destroy their habitats. Wilderness areas are further damaged through abusive camping practices such as cutting down trees and leaving garbage on site. Criminal activity by the chronically homeless. Contrary to popular opinion, the typically chronically homeless person is not a hardened violent felon, but someone with a disproportionately high arrest rate for crimes such as public intoxication, petty theft, and trespassing. The longer someone is unsheltered and chronically homeless, the more involved he or she becomes in criminal behavior, largely due to the increased use of non-institutionalized survival strategies such as panhandling, street peddling, and theft. Being homeless creates the opportunity for having an arrest record. Chronically homeless people who are mentally ill are arrested also more than those who are not mentally ill. Many researchers have argued that the high rates of arrest and low-level offending by the chronically homeless are results of the criminalization of homelessness. Laws against lying down or sleeping in public, public excretion and urination, public intoxication, and the like make it difficult for street homeless to carry out routine behaviors in public places. Some police observers report that being homeless causes more strict enforcement for activities that are dealt with more leniently if the person can show a proof of address. Even if transients are not hardcore violent offenders, evidence from police case studies shows areas adjacent to homeless camps have higher levels of petty and serious crime unrelated to routine behaviors such as drug dealing and usage, disturbance, theft, prowling, burglary, panhandling, fighting, vandalism, armed robbery, rape, and aggravated assault. Stolen property, weapons, and wanted felons have also been found in homeless camps. There is a threat to business viability. Urban homeless camps have a more immediate impact on the nearby community because of proximity. Many chronically homeless behaviors such as sleeping on the streets, panhandling, public excretion, or urination and public intoxication are threatening or undesirable. In some urban settings, police rate transients and their behaviors as a bigger problem than drugs, car burglaries, public fighting, cursing, or noise. Entertainment districts are particularly vulnerable to transient behavior because of the availability of people with disposable income, park benches, unattended public restrooms, and lax enforcement of laws governing street behavior. The presence of transients creates an environment of lawlessness. During the day, transients sitting in front of businesses can scare away customers. In Brevard County, Florida, where I was for quite a while, Daily Bread is shutting down its feeding program because of the congestion of homeless individuals in the business district. In St. Augustine, Florida, where I visited many times, many homeless people are seen sleeping on the public benches at the parking garage and in the historic streets as they are accessible to public restrooms. Regular citizens may not use public parks and other facilities because they fear the spaces are controlled by transients. Often the homeless are victimized at night, prompting them to sleep only during daylight hours in parks and other public places. Thus, the park may be laden with individuals sleeping on benches or in public shelters during the park's busiest hours. Further, due to the homeless taking over and sometimes vandalizing park barbecues, sinks, and faucets designed for regular park visitors to use, officials may remove those amenities, thereby penalizing everyone. Because so many chronically homeless people have medical problems and substance abuse issues and frequently meet the police and social service providers, they can be very costly to taxpayers. Just as a small number of criminals commit most of the crime and a few addresses in a city account for most of the calls for service, studies have found that about 10% of all homeless people consume about half of the resources. Investing in services to reduce homelessness will save money for everybody in the community. Camps are usually located close to goods and services that transients need: food, alcohol, employment or crime opportunities, and cold night shelters. Services geared toward this population obviously contribute to a concentration of transients in certain areas. Although soup kitchens attract the chronically homeless, food pantries are less popular with transients because they lack the facilities to cook the items that pantries distribute. Social service providers and day labor sites attract some transient. Liquor stores and drug markets attract others. Homes and businesses are targets for theft or burglary, but also for short term work for those that may be so inclined. Because many transients don't have their own vehicles, camps, even in wooded areas, are likely to be located by pedestrian access points such as trails or close to public transportation facilities and railroad tracks. In Brevard County, some of the homeless individuals located in camps near the tracks actually die by train, either by suicide or because they pass out on the rails. Transients look for overgrown brush to help hide their camp from public view, providing privacy and the opportunity to establish the camp before it's discovered and dealt with by the authorities. Many homeless individuals will seek out abandoned homes and buildings also for shelter. People in homeless camps benefit from food and clothing provided by church groups, missions, and social service agencies, but such charity is not usually combined with efforts to facilitate transition from the streets. In some respects, that enables camp residents to actually stay where they are. In other words, sometimes helping does hurt. So, understanding your local problem, let's talk about the stakeholders. In addition to criminal justice agencies, the following groups have an interest in homeless camps problem and should be considered for the contribution they might make in gathering information about the problem and responding to it. If you have a local continuum of care addressing homeless issues in the community, all of the agencies I'm now going to be, or organizations that I'm going to be listing should be actually a part of that continuum. Unfortunately, in most cases, the continuum of care is primarily just the first one, or the first and second, the social service agencies and religious and charitable organizations. But if you want to be effective, you need to involve all of the different groups I'm going to name. The first one being the social service agencies. Government agencies and non-government organizations that serve homeless populations are obviously interested in improving the living conditions for their clients, but they're also interested in reducing the level of resources consumed by a few chronically needy clients. They also have data that police may not have, and expertise and resources to improve the responses. These agencies need to work with their local continuum of care to address and reduce homelessness. Rogue agencies doing their own thing outside of the continuum often make matters worse for the homeless individual. Religious and charitable organizations serving the transient population. As social service agencies, these groups are interested in improving transient lives. Their mission, however, may focus on meeting the transient's daily needs, such as food, clothing, and emergency shelter, and preclude involvement in strategies that will ultimately reduce the need to carry out their missionary work. These organizations can sometimes provide monetary support for programs, and their staff and congregations might be a valuable source for volunteer work. Religious organizations can also help shape the moral content of public policy discussions about how to respond to transient camps. Religious and charitable organizations should work within the coordination of the continuum of care. Otherwise, without intention, they may end up maintaining rather than reducing homelessness. Transients themselves clearly have a strong interest in this problem. Although they may not prefer life on camps, they still regard these places as their homes and expect that others will respect their privacy and personal belongings. Transients can be a valuable source of information about who lives in the camps and the activities of other transients. When you approach a camp, don't just walk in and invade their space. Be respectful, announce yourself beforehand. Residents that live close to homeless camps suffer disproportionately from crimes committed by the transient campers. Their interest may not extend beyond pushing the problem out of their immediate area. Nearby residents may provide information about individual transients and the nature of crime and disorder associated with transients in particular camps. Businesses are frequent targets of transient crimes and the social and physical disorder accompanying them. Because businesses' viability can be adversely affected by transients in the areas, business owners are motivated to support practical solutions. They can provide resources for programs once they discover how they can effectively reduce the problems that impact their businesses. Efforts to address homeless camps and homelessness in general are often met with hostility from the public, perhaps because they resent public resources being spent on people seen as unproductive members of society, or because they think providing services will encourage more transients to move into the area. Many members of a community would rather push the problem out of their area rather than deal with it in a meaningful way. That's the not in my backyard approach, or NIMBY approach. Depending on your response, citizens can provide volunteer or financial support. How your local media covers homeless camps can influence the community's perception of the issue. Stories about transients and interviews with representatives of homeless advocacy organizations can be quite compelling, but they also can be exploitive. However, if this is the only side of the issue the public hears, you may have trouble galvanizing support for problem solving. Involving the media in early planning efforts can work to your advantage, especially if they can convey your message that solving this problem will likely take much longer than expected and possibly involve some false starts and failures. Elected officials have an interest in being responsive to citizens' calls for tougher enforcement of laws concerning transient public behavior. At the same time, they can direct funding towards projects they think will address the issue. Involve them at the early part of the planning stages to ensure their cooperation rather than when fiscal resources are needed. People who run the local government's daily operations want to increase efficiency and would be receptive to strategies to reduce the demand for public resources from a small number of transients. If a camp needs to be removed, city officials can provide the personnel such as zoning and land use enforcement officers and parks and rec staff. Human or social service officers can recommend nonprofit organizations to help identify the problem and actually create a successful strategy. Also, these local government offices may be involved in advocating for and coordinating the receipt of HUD funding, like community development block grants, emergency shelter grants, and home investment trust funds, and state resources for addressing homelessness issues. County officials are concerned with ensuring a coordinated regional approach to homelessness issues. Counties also control state pass-through resources. Although it may be tempting to move the problem from your jurisdictional boundaries, it's more responsible to create a strategy that does not impact neighboring communities. Given the controversy that typically surrounds interventions involving the chronically homeless, it's important to keep the chief of police and command staff advised of the details of the project and even to include them in planning. They may have insights to offer about the political realities in your jurisdiction and can provide a buffer between you and concerned advocates, media, and politicians. And at the end of this section, I really want to impress on you the need to have all of these groups involved in your continuum of care. You should have a representative, at least one representative from each of these groups active in your continuum. So now that we've described the camps and all the individuals who should be involved in the process of solving the issue of homelessness in your community related to camps and unsheltered homeless, let's start talking about how to address the issues. And the first thing to do is ask the right questions. How many people live in the homeless camps in your jurisdiction? What do you know about them? Where did they live before they entered the campsite? What is their gender, age, race, or ethnicity and employment history? How many of them have chronic health issues, substance abuse problems, mental health issues? What is known about the criminal victimization of transients living in camps? What's known about the criminal behavior of the transients living in the camps? How long have these individuals been living there? Why do transients report living in camps instead of other types of shelters? Do the transients know about and use community services such as soup kitchens, drop-in centers, shelters, job training, substance abuse treatment? Do they have access to affordable health care and the federally qualified health care centers? All kinds of services out there that they may not know about or have access to. To find the number of unsheltered homeless people in your county or state level, look at the data compiled annually in the point-in-time count for HUD as part of their application for the Continuum of Care grants. This report doesn't usually give the exact number of people living in homeless camps in municipalities. However, if this is your type of jurisdiction, it's still a good starting point to get a sense of the problem and the percentage of homeless people who are unsheltered in your area. There are three primary methods for counting unsheltered homeless people. Your community's characteristic depends on which is most appropriate. First of all, the first one is called the public places method, a direct count of people in a non-shelter location. That is, walking through a homeless camp and taking a head count. This works if you know where the campsites are and can reliably count everyone residing there. The second method is to augment the counts in non-shelter locations with an interview component, hoping to ensure people counted were not counted twice and are homeless. Conducting interviews is recommended if you also want to get information about this population as part of your project's scanning process. You could learn what services the subjects use and what it would take for them to leave the chronically homeless lifestyle. And the third method involves counting the users of soup kitchens and other social services for the homeless. And I will address all these ways to count the homeless in your community at a later video focused specifically on the point in time count. So are there seasonal patterns for homeless camps? Are there more people in such places in the summer or the winter? Where are the camps located? How accessible or remote are the camps? How visible are they from a distance? Who owns or has jurisdiction in the camp areas for policing, landscaping, maintenance, etc.? Are they publicly or privately owned? Why are the campsites located where they are? Are they close to food and water sources of transportation? Are they concealed? Do they provide shelter from the weather? How elaborate are the camps? Are they shelters, cooking facilities, bathing facilities, potable and non-potable water sources, and security features? Are there health and safety concerns such as unsafe fire situations and poor waste management? What is the allowable land use according to municipal code of the area where the camp is located? Who else uses the area around the camp? Do transient and legitimate users conflict over the area? What are the community standards regarding street behavior? In entertainment districts, do people prefer things to be orderly or more exciting to attract people? How many citizen complaints do you receive about homeless camps? What is the nature of those complaints? How many crimes are committed against people living in camps? What is the nature of those crimes? How serious are they? How many calls for service concerning camp areas does your agency receive? How many calls for service concerning nuisance problems involving transients does your agency receive? How many of them are from businesses and residents close to camps? How many incidents involve disputes over public space does your agency handle? How much time and money does your agency spend dealing with problems associated with homeless camps? How has the homeless camp problem in your jurisdiction been handled in the past? How is it handled now? Is the current response adequate and appropriate? What laws currently regulate homeless camps? Are these laws adequate and or constitutional? What is being done now in your community to address chronic homelessness? Does your community have a long-range plan to end chronic homelessness? How many contacts with chronic homeless people do members of your department make? What are the outcomes of those contacts? Does your department have the formal policies with shelter and social service agencies regarding referrals and the transportation of chronically homeless people? What efforts have been made by social service providers to discourage transients from living on campuses? Have such efforts been successful? In my own experience, what's really important to me in the nonprofit world is to make sure your agency or your program has outcomes in place, outcomes that are manageable and reachable. And in this case, the outcome, of course, is housing the homeless, getting them off the streets and out of the camps into the homes. But in order to have outcomes, you have to have indicators. You have to have ways to measure your response to the camps. So here are the indicators that I would list. Reduce the number of camps and transients living in them. Less crime in areas around the camps. Fewer or less serious crimes committed against transients living in camps. fewer calls for police service to the camp area, fewer calls for police service for nuisance problems caused by the campers, fewer calls for police service by business and residents concerning the campers, fewer citizen complaints about transient behavior in camps, fewer health and safety hazards associated with the camps, reduced number of conflicts between transients and others over use of public space, lower the costs of police response dealing with the camps, increase use of social services by campers, and improve communication between the police and the social service providers. Following are the numerous responses to the problem of homeless camps. Because of the intense public debate in many cities about how to deal with homelessness, it's a good idea to involve homeless advocacy groups early in your planning process. Otherwise, you risk being derailed later by legal challenges. Other stakeholders, particularly those who may be making demands for police action, such as residents, business owners, politicians, and city officials, should be involved in negotiating what's acceptable in public spaces. Dismantling homeless camps or altering the environmental features to discourage living there can easily be perceived as cruel by some if they don't understand how the overall effort will improve the lives of both transients and the larger community. Notwithstanding your efforts, it's unlikely that all will agree with the goal of eradicating homeless camps. Community members often don't understand the factors that give rise to homelessness and the constitutional limits on police trying to manage problems associated with chronically homeless people on the streets. Better informed citizens may be more receptive to fundraising efforts for programs and services for the homeless and may be less resistant to the placement of facilities for homeless people in their neighborhoods. Negative interactions between police officers and homeless people can be avoided through educational efforts to change police culture and attitudes towards homelessness. Inviting homeless advocacy groups to help design and offer a curriculum can be very useful in building positive interagency relationships. Police involvement in planning community-wide strategies to end homelessness is beneficial. Other people involved in planning need to hear what resources your department can bring to the table, as well as any limits on your involvement. So work with your continuum of care coalition of homeless services. Have the police involved in that continuum. Promote the Housing First model. This strategy for housing chronically homeless puts them into their own permanent housing units first, instead of first trying to treat the underlying problems to make them housing ready. The housing is seen mainly as a place to live. Treatment comes later. By implementing Housing First in Brevard County, we were initially able to reduce homelessness by 52%. Now, I will tell you that homelessness has increased since COVID in Brevard County, but that's primarily because of not because of Housing First, but because of the lack of affordable housing and the increased prices for rent and mortgage. Lobbying for more resources for mental health and substance abuse. Given the strong relationship between residency and homeless camps and dual diagnoses of addiction and mental illness, effective strategies to get people out of camp life include long-term integrated treatment and comprehensive case management. Many communities have groups actively involved to increase state and local government funding of these services. Case management tends to be the last thing paid for, but as I said in one of my earlier videos, when we set up our program, we put case management at the end when they were actually placed in permanent supportive housing. Retrospectively, I now would actually put case management at the very beginning with intake, and start that case management process then before they actually are placed into housing. Regulating structured camping facilities. This involves setting up an area where transients can camp in relative safety without the fear of violating laws and ordinances, and receiving services if they follow the facility rules. In St. Pete, I visited a campus for the unsheltered homeless that centralized their social service demands, including food, shelter, medical care, and employment services. The camp was set up in a remote business district away from residential homes. Now, if they're near residential homes, such facilities are likely to garner negative reactions from nearby residents and business owners who fear an influx of petty criminals and drop in property values and quality of life. Involving them early in the planning process can help reduce those not in my backyard responses, or NIMBY. Tent cities, if they're not properly run, can be problematic. Typical restrictions specified in municipal codes for jurisdictions that permit tent cities may include requiring a meeting with the community before establishing the camp, limiting the camp's existence to a few months, limiting the number of camps that can operate in the jurisdiction at any time, limit the number of times a location can be used for a camp at a particular time, require a certain number of toilet and shower facilities, restrict the use of heating and cooking devices, specify a minimum distance for the campsite from sensitive areas such as schools, churches, playgrounds, daycare centers, specify a minimum distance from public transportation, specify the provision of social services to help homeless people out of their situations, and set in codes of conduct for the residents. Moving on to the physical environment, transients like camps to be surrounded by overgrown vegetation, but that can make the camps difficult for police to enter safely, especially at night. Before clearing the brush, first determine who owns the land. Multi-agency cooperation may be necessary on land owned by the Park Service, municipal parks and rec departments, or transportation and highway departments. You may also need to consult a landscape architect about what kinds of plants should replace what's removed. If a lot of brushes need to be cleared, consider asking neighborhood residents to help out. Clearing brushes can be effective short term, however, unless there are other changes to the area that make it unattractive to transients, the camp is likely to reappear when the brush grows back. It is also possible the camp will move to another location. If the camp is close to neighboring jurisdictions, it can be worthwhile to work with agencies in these jurisdictions to anticipate and prevent that displacement. If the chronically homeless have set up camps in relatively small urban parks, setting up water sprinklers to go off at various times can make sitting or lying on the grass less comfortable. Sprinklers on buildings can also be used to prevent people from sleeping on sidewalks. Fencing and other barriers can make space less desirable for camps because of the increased effort needed to reach the camp. On the other hand, making it harder to get to the camp means it's less likely to be detected by police on a routine patrol, which may serve to make the site actually more attractive. Dismantling park benches and the like, or installing spikes and other devices to discourage sitting or lying on flat raised surfaces can make places less attractive for idle transients, but this will affect the street homeless and legitimate user of public space equally, as each will be denied a place to sit and rest. Better approaches involve encouraging property owners to modify services in benign ways or construct them so they do not promote long-term sitting. Example including central armrests on benches, slanted surfaces at the bases of walls, prickly vegetation in planter boxes, and narrow or pointed treatments on tops of fences and ledges. Health codes in many communities prohibit feeding people in public without appropriate permits and measures to ensure food safety. Zoning codes often specify what activities are allowable when providing services to homeless people. So you may want to restrict public feeding of transients. And you can divert donations from the public. Well-intentioned people who leave donations of food and clothing at campsites may not realize that their actions may do more to enable transients rather than help them out of their chronically homeless lifestyle. Public education can encourage citizens to direct their charitable energies towards programs and services that reduce the need of homeless camps rather than supporting them. There are some ways to reduce negative impacts of routine activities of the chronically homeless. One is installing more public toilets. If your community has a problem with homeless people excreting and urinating in public, it may be because there's no place for them to go. Open a day resource center. There are one-stop shops where the chronically homeless can access services, use bathing facilities, receive health care, food, etc. People who reside in urban camps are likely to benefit and, at the very least, will be off the street and out of public view for most of the day. Camp dwellers who work during the day do not need the drop-in component of a day resource center, but could more effectively access services. Opponents think this will bring in more people, so providers of these facilities should strongly consider connecting the receipt of services to some sort of programming to transition people out of homelessness. Work with your land use enforcement officers. Most jurisdictions have land use codes that can prohibit homeless camps on private property. They include restrictions or specifications on the type of ancillary dwelling units permitted on property and regulations against camping. Squatting in buildings is generally prohibited through codes setting safety standards for occupancy of structures. And even though those codes exist, abandoned buildings are attractive to the homeless individuals as a shelter. So more emphasis should be placed on the actual building owner or home owner to make sure they do not remain vacant, or if they are vacant, that they are taken care of. Next is cleaning up campsites. Removal of trash and debris from homeless camps can improve the unsanitary conditions that exist there. However, without taking steps to permanently remove the habitats, this response is likely to result in long-term change to the camp and may inspire them to continue to stay there. Shutting down homeless camps, this response takes cleaning up campsites much further and includes strategy to permanently remove the transients and discourage their return. The procedure for shutting them down is multi-staged. Most successful plans include these elements generally in this order. First, visit the camp to determine how many people live there, if they have any special needs, if there are any environmental hazards that need to be handled by trained personnel, and the proper deployment of police officers and others to adequately carry out the plan. Second, determine which law enforcement agencies have jurisdiction in the camp area. If there's more than one, often the case in wilderness areas where state and federal agencies may have jurisdiction, establish a memorandum of understanding that specifies which agency will be responsible for law enforcement, safety, and environmental protection, and who will do what while the response is being implemented. Next, find out who owns the property in question. The laws pertaining to the legality of camps vary depending on whether the land is private or publicly owned. Become familiar with your jurisdiction's laws regarding removal of personal property and people from camps. Meet with representatives from homeless advocacy groups to advise them of your plan and why you're doing it. Data collected during the scanning phase of your project will be useful here. Consider inviting these groups to come along on your subsequent contacts with transients at the campsite. Arrange alternate shelter through the continuum of care for the transients before you remove them from the camp. This is an important step to avoid legal challenges based on the unconstitutionality of punishing someone for carrying out a physiological need, sleeping. Provide all transients with a written notice advising them they are violating the law by camping in the park, under the freeway pass, etc. They are subject to further law enforcement if they remain in the area of the location of the alternate shelter arranged specifically for them, and by which date they must vacate the area. After the date of vacation passes, return to the camp and issue citations for those still there. Tell them about the date by which they must vacate and that they will be subject to arrest and seizure of property if they don't leave by then. After the second notice passes, they arrest any remaining transients and store their belongings. Ask other agencies or government departments to assist you in removing the property. Be careful about potential constitutional violations regarding searches of property. Maintain another MOU detailing who will be responsible for ensuring the camp is not rebuilt. Consider having each agency contribute some resources for regular patrols of the affected areas, and ensure you have the capacity to immediately clean up an area if it begins to reestablish itself. Cut back any excessive foliage that hides the camp area. Post signage in the former camp indicating that camping is not permitted in the area. Stores in areas populated by transients may be especially vulnerable to cart theft because many of their customers are pedestrians and cannot transport their goods home without a shopping cart. Further, these stores may lack the resources to install security devices on the carts or to allocate staff and a vehicle to patrol the neighborhoods to pick up the stray carts. Next, improving police interactions. About a quarter of the sheriff's offices and local police departments have written policies for contact with homeless people. The policy should include procedures for casual contacts and arrest, as well as details about how to give notices to illegal campers and deal with the of homeless people. The use of appropriate record-keeping tools to support efforts to access the effectiveness of your intervention could also be mandated by policy. Police departments in many cities such as Santa Monica and San Diego, California, Pinellas Park and Fort Lauderdale, Florida, New York City, Albuquerque, New Mexico have established units to deal specifically with homeless people. And there are different types of these units. In one variation, police accompany outreach workers on patrols through areas frequented by homeless people. Homeless people are contacted or transported to services. In Fort Lauderdale, police officers on the homeless outreach team learned that wearing a uniform and driving a marked patrol car made it easier to contact homeless people. Being approached by someone in plain clothes and an unmarked car made the homeless much more fearful. Another variation is based less on patrol and more on crisis intervention. An example is the homeless outreach team in San Diego, where in addition to homeless outreach efforts, police officers partner with mental health clinicians in a psychiatric emergency response team. A third variation is exemplified by the Homeless Liaison program in Santa Monica. There, a specifically trained unit of about 6 police officers reaches out to transients and refers them to services. The HLP team established contacts with short-term and long-term housing providers, job placement services, and treatment programs for mental illness and substance abuse disorders. Now, that's quite a few strategies for dealing with homeless camps. And now here are some less effective strategies. First of all, enforcing sidewalk behavior ordinances. Sidewalk behavior ordinances prohibit behaviors on public sidewalks. Examples of those prohibited behaviors include lying or sitting on the sidewalk or on any object placed on the sidewalk, impeding or obstructing the passage of pedestrians by getting in their way or putting obstacles on the sidewalk, leaving belongings unattended on sidewalks, and soliciting. There have been successful class action legal challenges to arrests of homeless people for sleeping in public places and carrying out other life-sustaining functions. The court decision rules have generally been, are the plaintiffs involuntary homeless? If your community does not have enough shelter beds to house all the homeless people, a court is likely to rule, based on precedent, that homelessness is not a choice and thus involuntary. Do the plaintiffs have access to non-public spaces to carry out punished activities? If your community lacks bathing and toilet facilities for the homeless, enforcement of laws prohibiting those activities could run into legal challenges. Are the activities for which the plaintiff is being punished involuntary? Courts have tended to rule that sleeping and excretion are involuntary. Beyond the legal impediments to enforcing these ordinances, it's likely that some offenders might welcome being arrested for those sort of activities. It gives them a chance to be off the street for a short period of time in a place where they can eat, get warm, and clean up. Before long, they'll be back in the same area doing the very same things again for which they were arrested. Next is enforcing ordinances against panhandling. Only a small percentage of chronically homeless people are actually panhandlers. Therefore, cracking down on panhandlers is not likely to have any significant impact on the homeless camps. Furthermore, the legal impediments to successful enforcement of anti-begging laws are great. Next is doing bum sweeps. One common strategy is the bum sweep, where police temporarily concentrate resources in a troubled area and arrest a lot of homeless people for minor offenses or on outstanding warrants. Sweeps can clean up an area very quickly, but they're not generally effective for several reasons. First, they can create an adversarial relationship between this group and the police, and second, they can encourage unproductive interaction with homeless advocates. Finally, there's no evidence that sweeps have any real long-term effect. Creating safe zones. These areas wherein homeless people can live without fear of arrest for carrying out routine behaviors of daily life typically combine temporary shelter with services such as medical care, meals, and employment assistance. Homeless camp residents prefer these to shelters. In practice, those safe zones are not effective. Their location in industrial parts of cities makes community opposition unlikely, but also isolates inhabitants from the services and employment opportunities that might help them transition out of chronic homelessness. It's also possible that this isolation might increase the divide between safe zone residents, and housed people. Increasing the capacity of local shelters. It's not always true that people reside in transient camps due to lack of shelter space. Campers resist going to shelters for a variety of reasons. Some shelters cost too much, prohibit alcohol use, couple shelter with religious outreach, or refuse admittance to those with certain types of criminal histories, sex offenders in particular. Those who are denied entry once are not likely to try again. Relaxing those rules may make shelters more palatable to this group of chronically homeless people. On the other hand, allowing anyone into shelters would lead others to avoid them for personal safety reasons. Finding a balance here would be very difficult. Finally, in conclusion, the objective is to help homeless people and families find and maintain housing using the Housing First model. If housing is not readily available, homeless outreach workers may need to provide what they call shelter-in-place services for the homeless individuals. This would require frequent visits by the outreach team to ensure that their needs are met and provide wellness checks. Local church groups then can also coordinate with these outreach teams to provide clothing, food, blankets, and other resources through the efforts of the outreach worker and case managers. Therefore, the church teams are actually helping towards the process of the actual process in place to help these individuals get out of the camps and into their own homes. Thank you for your time, and I hope that you will like and subscribe.